In this lesson, we'll learn how we can take advantage of the 3ds Max Activeshade feature. Okay, so the Activeshade is pretty much an interactive rendering feature, so we can use this to see in pretty much an instantaneous feedback as far as now being able to make lighting and material adjustments within 3ds Max. Alright, so there's a couple of different ways of accessing this Activeshade feature. One is to go all the way down to the end of your toolbar, and right now where it says Render Production, if we press and hold, there's a few different options available to us. We have the middle button right here, which is Render Iterative, which we'll talk about in one of our later lessons. And down at the very bottom, we have the Activeshade. So if we enable the Activeshade, you can see the Activeshade is currently being rendered, and it will render from whatever viewport we currently have active. So let's make sure that we do have the perspective view active. Let's again go back to the Activeshade. Right, and we can see that now this little preview render. So what's nice about this is the fact that we can now start to come in and basically make some interactive adjustments. So if I were to select my light over here, activate my move tool, and let's say we're to come in here and now reposition this light to someplace different. Now without having to press any additional buttons or make any additional changes, we can see exactly what this looks like within this Activeshade. You can see it's pretty fast feedback, although this is definitely not what we would consider as something that's going to be final render quality, especially if you're going to be using Mental Ray. So while this is a really nice feature, there are some pretty significant drawbacks to be aware of whenever using this Activeshade. Number one is that the Activeshade is based on 3ds Max's default scanline render. So what that means is that if we're going to be using any kind of specialized Mental Ray materials or any special Mental Ray features on the lights themselves, those features will not show up within the Activeshade. So if we had any objects in our scene that happen to be using any Mental Ray materials or anything like that, those objects would simply show up just black within this Activeshade view. So really you can think of this as being best for adjusting things like lights and materials within the viewport, because one of the things that we'll find within this Activeshade is that we actually can't allow it to update things like movement in our objects or things like that. So one thing that we can actually do, as opposed to having the Activeshade open in a separate window, is we can actually turn any of our viewports into an Activeshade as well. So if I were to take this perspective view, and just click on the perspective caption up here, and go all the way down to the bottom of this menu, which is currently being cut off on your screen, but all the way down at the very bottom we have Activeshade. So once I turn that on, now this perspective view is an Activeshade. So if I were to come in and, let's say, grab one of these spheres and move one of these up, you notice that the Activeshade does not update to represent that new position of the sphere. All right, and if I were to now come in and grab this light and begin moving this around, we can actually see that there are some rendering errors that are occurring. So you notice now the top part of the sphere is kind of black in appearance, and that's because the sphere is now technically up sort of off the frame, but this sphere is still being calculated with the shadow maps in their new position. So while this sphere itself is still being rendered in its old position, so we have kind of now this mismatch of the shadow information and the actual positioning of this sphere. So if we want to close this Activeshade, just simply right click and go up to Close in your quad menu, and now we're back to our regular view. Now we can go back to our perspective, re-enable the Activeshade, and now this is rendering out correctly. Right, now similar to what we saw in our previous lesson dealing with the render frame window, we can also draw ourselves a region to be updated within this Activeshade. So if we were to right click in this and within the quad menu choose Draw Region, you can see now my cursor's changed where we can come in, draw out a particular area. Now as I start to come in and make adjustments to lights or materials, it's only changing and updating within this one small area. Right, so if I wanted to remove this region, just again make sure that my Draw Region feature is active. You'll notice that again my cursor is a little bit different, and now if I just click anywhere out of this open space, the region disappears, which means now this entire area should update. Right, and if it's not, Let's again just right click and make sure that this draw region is inactive. Let's try that again. All right, so it looks like we have a little bit of an issue here where you can see that the entire frame is actually updating, but we do still sort of have a mismatch between these different areas. So again, this can sometimes happen. All we have to do is just close out this Activeshade, go back and re-enable that once again, and now everything should be fine. All right, very nice. So like I said, this Activeshade is a nice feature as far as being able to preview some very basic lights and material adjustments almost in real time. But like I said, there are some pretty significant limitations that you do need to be aware of as far as if you happen to be working with any mental ray materials or any special mental ray features. Those types of things cannot be viewed within the Activeshade. So in our next lesson, we're going to begin taking a very introductory look at working with materials within 3ds Max.